Most people consider Serena Williams to be the greatest server in the history of women's tennis, and I definitely agree. Serena is the greatest. However, Serena is not the ace queen. That title belongs to somebody else, and that player's name is Karolina Pliskova. In 5 out of the last 8 years, Pliskova won the ace title. In 2015, she served 517 aces, finished number 1. In 2016, she served 530 aces, finished number 1. In 2017, she served 452 aces, also finished number 1. In 2018, Julia Gerges served the most aces with 492. In 2019, Pliskova was back on top with 488 aces. In 2020, there wasn't really a lot of tennis played, and Rybakina finished number 1 with 193 aces. In 2021, Pliskova was back on top with 410 aces. In 2022 and 2023, Pliskova's results started to decline. Interestingly, in those 2 years, Garcia served most aces in 2022, 394, and in 2023, 462. So in 2023, Pliskova suffered a lot of early exit, very uncharacteristic for her. Her ranking started to drop, and even early this year, she wasn't winning a lot of matches. So I was very happy to see her win a 250 in Romania last week by winning all her matches in straight sets. Her ranking jumped from 78 in the world to 59 in the world, and this will give her much needed confidence to continue climbing up the rankings. And I wouldn't be surprised if she finishes 2024 with most aces served. Now, when it comes to the general public looking at serves, it is very rarely that people look at a female serve and try to copy that serve. Most people look at the greatest male servers in the history of tennis and try to adapt some of their techniques. Now, when it comes to the men, there are some very clean and simple motions that could possibly be copied. Now, I don't recommend that you copy anybody's serve. You should develop your own style, but theoretically, you could adapt some of the techniques of servers that have simple motions. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of complex and difficult motions among the greatest male servers in the history of tennis. For example, Pete Sampras, Ivo Karlovic, Nick Kyrgios, Andy Roddick, or even Ben Shelton. Those are incredibly difficult serves to copy. Number one, they're very complex, they're very difficult to time, and most importantly, most players won't have body actions fast enough to be able to load and set up the serve the way those players do. So ultimately, what ends up happening if you try to copy those serves, for example, Nick Kyrgios, in my experience, a lot of my private students, they love Nick's serve and they try to copy it. I very seldom see that this style is going to work at the rec level because players simply can't time a motion that's so quick, and they actually don't have body actions that are fast enough, and end up with all kinds of fundamental errors on their serve. So what makes a lot of sense is to actually look at some of the greatest servers on the WTA Tour and adapt some of their techniques. Now, why would that be the case? Because generally, when you look at WTA players, they don't serve as well as the men. I gave you the ace statistics. On the men's tour, the person that serves the most aces in a year is around 1,000. So what you'll see among the greatest female servers is that they don't generally rely so much on their raw athleticism, but rather the natural ways to create power on the serve. And that is exactly what Karolina Pliskova does. Now, the haters will say Pliskova can only serve well because she's 6'1". And you have to understand, I've said this before, it doesn't matter that you're tall if you don't have proper serve mechanics. I know a lot of tall tennis players with weak serves. Yes, Pliskova being 6'1" has an advantage, especially when it comes to aces, because she's going to be able to serve better angles. That indeed is the difference between, in my opinion, the two greatest female servers in history, Pliskova and Serena. Pliskova hits more aces than Serena. Doesn't mean that she has a better serve. I do think that Serena has the greatest serve in the history of the women's game. But Pliskova is able to get angles that Serena can, that's solely based on her height. Now, when it comes to Pliskova's technique, she utilizes a lot of the natural ways of getting power. And what are those? Well, first of all, she has a higher toss, and people will often criticize a high toss. Now, you have to understand that often a higher toss is related to the rest of the motion. So most WTA players have a higher toss, especially the ones with really good serves. Well, first of all, a higher toss in itself can give you a little bit more power. I often use the example of a volleyball serve, where of course the volleyball itself is much heavier than a tennis ball, And volleyball players throw that ball way up into the air. They jump up and make contact with it. Now, the ball dropping from a high place develops momentum on its own, and that momentum can be transferred into the hand. This is somewhat true on the tennis serve as well. When the toss is higher, you get to use some of the momentum that's built up from the ball itself and transfer that into the contact. Now, more importantly, a high toss is related to the rest of the motion. So most players, both ATP and WTA, who have a high toss also serve with a lag. Now, this is very necessary. You won't be able to lag the racket behind unless you throw the ball up higher. It will only work with a super explosive quick serve a la Nick Kyrgios or Goran Ivanisevic. But those serves are very difficult to pull off and rare. Most players will let the power develop gradually, so they will toss the ball up first, the racket will lag behind, and then they will start to slowly take their racket up, start to load their body, and then unload the entire system into the contact. And that's exactly what Pliskova does. She has a full take back. In other words, the racket goes all the way towards the back fence. And now as she begins to take her racket up, she also starts to load her body. Now, Pliskova has something that a lot of people are concerned with, and that is a low elbow position. So she tosses the ball up first, the racket goes all the way back, and as she pulls it in, the elbow stays kind of low. And people see this and they think this is a mistake. But one thing you have to realize is, number one, Andy Roddick had a low elbow position, and he is one of the greatest servers in the history of tennis. So this can't be wrong just by simple logic. But in actuality, if you look at the biomechanics of what happens to the elbow when the racket begins to drop, is that if you have a high elbow position, this is a huge disadvantage. So if your elbow is above the level of your shoulder, the elbow doesn't have a lot of room to go up, because you have to understand that when the racket begins to drop, the elbow goes out and up. So by having the elbow slightly below the level of the shoulder, you have more of a runway, more range of motion, in other words, to be able to accelerate faster upwards towards the ball. So Pliskova's elbow position is not wrong. In actuality, it might be an advantage.
One of the most common issues on the serve that I see at the recreational level is when players coil too much. So they get their elbow too far back and they get their chest pointing towards the back fence. Often this is a loading position that's too difficult to get out of. And one of the problems that occurs when players have an extreme loading position that's not suited for them is that they end up not rotating properly, and they have a leftward approach towards the ball if they happen to be right-handed. So it's important for everybody to understand that while there's nothing wrong with coiling like Sampras or Federer, players need to understand their body and make sure that they're able to get out of the loading position. We can see here on Pliskova's serve, she has a sufficient coil. The elbow needs to be at least in line with the torso. We can see here that the elbow is slightly behind, and she's also slightly turned backwards. You will see this particular loading position on most of the best WTA serves. Now, why would that be the case? Well, a minority of female servers will be able to coil further, but generally female servers have body actions that are slightly less explosive compared to the men. And for these type of players, this indeed is the optimal loading position.
Now, another thing that Pliskova does in that trophy phase of the serve is that she bends her body in a reversed C shape. She sticks her non-dominant hip slightly into the court. And this is an advantage for two reasons. Number one is that when she throws the ball inside the court, and now she's going to get effortless forward momentum. She's going to get all her body weight transferred into the contact. This is something that you should do on your serve, especially when we're talking about a flat serve or a slice serve. You got to throw the ball inside the court, and then when the racket approaches the trophy face, you got to begin to lean forward. If you lean forward without putting the body in a reverse C, you're going to be off balance and you're going to likely fall into the court. So what a lot of players do to counteract that lack of balance is they bend their body backwards in a reverse C shape as they're leaning forward. Naturally, what you will see on players that utilize this style is that the majority of the weight in the loading phase of the serve, in other words, prior to the unloading phase, when the racket is in the trophy phase, is that 80 to 90% of the weight will be distributed on the front foot. How can we tell this is happening? Is because when you take a close look at players' pinpoint stance serve, you will see that very little weight is indeed placed on that back foot. You can see that the heel is higher off the ground and most of the weight is placed on that front foot. You'll see this among ATP players as well. For example, John Isner and many others. Now, is this something that you have to force? No, you just have to load the serve the correct way, and this is something that will happen naturally. And that's exactly what Karolina Pliskova does. She loads her serve perfectly. She leans slightly forward, puts her body in a reverse C, and she transfers all that energy into the contact. Now, is Pliskova's serve perfect? No, it is not. You will often see small technical deficiencies, even on some of the greatest servers on the WTA Tour. And first of all, Pliskova's serve doesn't have too much variety, so she doesn't utilize a kick serve on her second serve. She can slice her serve, but mostly on her first serve, she hits it flat. This is why I think that Serena has the greatest serve of all time, because Serena had more variety on her serve. And another thing that's suboptimal on Karolina's serve is the fact that she has a small racket drop leak. And for you guys that don't know what a racket drop leak is, I talked about this in depth with my student Felipe, where I not only explained what a racket drop leak is, but also how to fix it. But let me give you a brief overview. A racket drop leak is basically when the racket starts to drop prior to the body unloading. So the legs are still bent, the body is still loaded, and the racket already goes into the racket drop. Now, at the recreational level, the racket drop leak can be severe. In other words, players will often go all the way down with the racket before they start unloading, and now the runway up to the ball, the range of motion is very limited. In Karolina's case, she has a small racket drop leak. She goes to about right here at her head level, and this is where she begins to unload. So this is not the end of the world, but I do think that she could get maybe 1 to 2% more power if she got rid of that racket drop leak. Now, there is a player on the WTA Tour that serves exactly like Karolina Pliskova, who happens to have a better serve, and that's her sister, Christina Pliskova. Now, she reached a career high ranking of 35. She doesn't play anymore, but to me, Christina Pliskova has possibly the greatest female serve in the history of tennis. Now, the rest of her game wasn't nearly as good as Karolina's, and that's why her ranking was a lot lower. But the serve itself was absolutely perfect. First of all, Christina was lefty, which is, of course, an advantage when it comes to serving. But also, when we're talking about the way the racket goes up into the trophy position or the racket drop leak, it was a lot cleaner on Christina's serve. So Karolina's serve, she does have a little bit of wrist movement as the racket goes back. She does have a full take back, but there's some additional movement here, and then she straightens her wrist out. Not a big problem. It's only a problem if the wrist remains in an extended position, so this is not the end of the world. But on Christina's serve, you have a cleaner take back where the wrist is slightly bent as it goes up into the trophy position. Now, when we look at the pinpoint stance timing, Christina has a much cleaner timing where she starts pulling that back leg up as the racket is getting towards the trophy phase. So her unloading process is timed perfectly. So guys, it makes a lot of sense to take some of the technical characteristics that you see among the greatest WTA servers and apply them to your own game. They have a tendency to be natural ways of getting power that can translate really well to the recreational level for players of all ages.